Welcome back, all you lovely people, to another part of Bomb Month. Today's film is a 1985 historical epic which was based on, well, probably the single most famous and important war in American history. Not a bad idea necessarily, but this particular film celebrating the birth of America was directed by an Englishman. Wow, that should be such an oxymoron. Revolution's narrative tells of the story of the American Revolution from the perspective of an ordinary man, a fur trapper in fact, Tom Dobb, and his son Ned, caught up in major events against their wishes, drafted into the army, and then separated. Along the way, the son becomes brutalized by an incredibly strict British officer, Sergeant Major Peasley, while Tom becomes eloped with a rebellious aristocrat, Daisy McCulloch, and eventually learns to stand for and fight for his beliefs. Here we have a fine roster of performances, with Pacino once again commanding the screen and reminding us why he is one of the great actors of his generation. One major point of criticism was his pseudo-Cockney Bronx accent, but this actually fits considering A, this was before the states really established their own identities, so specific dialects didn't exist yet, and B, New York is shown as a mix of people and cultures, a melting pot of immigrants. Mainly a lot of Irish, English, and Scots, so it doesn't really feel all that out of place and odd, and the film perfectly establishes that context even if you know nothing about American history. He's determined but also sympathetic and able to sell the relationship with his son, played by Dexter Fletcher, who turns in a pretty decent showing and has some good chemistry with Pacino so that you can really buy them as father and son who do care a lot about each other. Natassia Kinski is suitably good, going from wide-eyed, highbrow brat to a dedicated woman of independence, even when the dialogue is a little bit fluffy and mushy, while Sutherland is suitably icy and stone-faced as Sergeant Peasley. Some have accused the character of being very one-note and archetypical, and while yes, he is pretty much the villain of the film, he is a hardened officer, so such a tough disposition is to be expected, and it never really stuck out to me as anything annoying or silly. From a visual standpoint, the film has rock-solid production values that really make southern England, where the film was made, look like colonial America, and Revolution even has an interesting ace up its sleeve thanks to its use of primarily handheld cinematography. A relatively new concept back in the 1980s, before every action director thought it was so intense and just completely aped it. This gives the film a quasi-documentary aesthetic, which very much fits with the main idea of the film, the war from the perspective of a normal, everyday man. Thankfully, there isn't a ton of ridiculous running about, so the dreaded shaky cam is an absolute minimum here. Also commendable is the score, a grand orchestral affair by classical veteran John Corigliano that mixes the pomp of someone like Williams or Vangelis, enhancing the epic feel and amping up the battles, with some of the more moving elements of something you'd expect of a Horner or Goldsmith piece, especially towards the end during the celebration of independence. It is a marvelous and layered piece, and is perhaps one of the more severely underrated scores in the 1980s, mixing a delicious combination of strings and woodwind to cover just about every spectrum imaginable for a film. And so we now come to the script, written by Robert Dillon. While the narrative itself is a little unbalanced for reasons I'll be getting into shortly, and the love story, which, come on, are you really that surprised that there is one here, is a tad simplistic and hokey, the film does forego a lot of the pomp this type of film tends to have, and is much the better for it. This is not a story about grand heroics or big speeches or sweeping vistas and ginormous battles. This is a film about the harsh realities of war and the struggle of standing up for what you believe in, and sometimes the nasty price that you have to pay for that. The idealism of freedom and independence quickly fades out as the grimy, gritty truth of this whole business sets in, and each of our characters undergoes a major change as a result. Tom goes from fear and neutrality and just wanting to save his own skin to full-blown commitment because of what happens to his son, while Daisy goes from being a wide-eyed young woman with ideals of freedom and incredible naivete to someone who is willing to throw herself into the midst of war, risking her life to get help and aid to those who most need it out there on the front line. For the most part, it's rather effective, and mixed with the handheld approach, makes you really feel like you're there and by this world. However, as I said, there are some hiccups, mainly due to some choppy editing and sudden location shifts that can be really jarring at times. It happens a handful of times during the film and is a dead giveaway of the problematic production of the film. One minute we can be in the middle of a town, and the next, boom, a battlefield, or we can jump from a sunny day to harsh winter without so much as a lead-in line or even a transition. It's really clunky, and considering how well thought out and even innovative other aspects of the film were, it can be a real irritant at times. I imagine this was the deal breaker for a lot of people back in 1985, hence the film's dreadful reception. And while I personally don't think it happens enough times to be a gigantic issue, it's still an annoying problem. And frankly, the inevitable love story that I mentioned beforehand that develops between Tom and Daisy, while not unwatchable by any means, doesn't mesh well with the realism and feels like the most Hollywood and artificial aspect of the whole thing. However, there is an alternative. In 2009, a director's cut was released entitled Revolution Revisited. This version removes about 10 minutes of footage and adds a new narration from Pacino as an older Tom Dobb, allowing us a way into his mind and his thoughts as the war goes on. While it moves along at a slightly slicker pace, the narration, though well performed by Pacino, is hit or miss. It's more reflective, oftentimes wondering about why things were the way they were, as opposed to most movie narration, which usually spoon-feeds things we can already see, and this does give his character a little more depth, as well as learn more about his background. However, director Hugh Hudson, who oversaw this version, occasionally puts the narration in irritating places, sometimes repeating what a character either says or is about to say, or amounts to just 2 lines during a short break when nothing is being said on the screen. Plus, despite cutting some footage, the occasional choppiness of the editing still rears its ugly head again. A particularly hilarious guffe where, for a second, the British soldiers at the first battle of the film flash bright orange. I'm not kidding, it was in the first cut and it's still here. I don't know if it's a processing error, I don't know if it's a camera fault, whatever it is, it's really jarring and out of place. And frankly, that sudden shift from one location to another, often in the middle of a sound like, say, singing or crowd talk or even a bit of score, is still here, and it really goads me. And I'm wondering how someone as experienced as Hudson could have been so clumsy recutting his own movie. But when all is said and done, this cut of Revolution does streamline the film more and focuses more on the father-son aspect, and really brings the idea of an ordinary man at a major historical moment more to the forefront, which is what it should be. Revolution may have its faults even in this cut, but it was a ballsy film for the time, and if you go in expecting more of an intimate historical drama than a big-budget historical epic, Hudson's film will, I hope, give you something to remember, and it isn't a bad way to spend 2 hours, regardless of which cut you go for. If you are curious, both cuts of the film have been put out on DVD, Revolution and Revolution Revisited individually, or if you're a Region 2 viewer, the BFI has put out an excellent Blu-ray DVD combo pack, with both cuts of the movie along with a bonus disc and a really detailed booklet about the making and reception of the film, as well as essays by several critics like Philip French on the film's merits. And so to close off, I must give both cuts of Revolution a silver star, as each one has aspects that both surpass and downgrade from the other, so it evens out to this score. Frankly though, both cuts are so cheap that really pick both up and make your own judgment, or just get the double pack if you live in Europe. It's an interesting bit of film history, and it's definitely a film I feel is worth re-evaluating. Join me next time for part 3 of Bomb Month, when I look at the even more infamous 1980 epic, Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate. See you all there.